So, for those of us that don't know this yet, Japan is a mountainous island nation in East Asia. It is an archipelago made up of thousands of islands, although the majority of the country is comprised of the home islands, or main islands, of Hokkaido, Honshu, or mainland Japan, Shikoku, and Kyushu. These four islands comprise nearly all of the country's total land area. Alright, so we all know where and what Japan is, and hopefully after this class, we all know the hiragana and katakana alphabets. However, none of us are quite so familiar with the history of the language we have been learning the past few months. Well, that's where we come in. You see, the Japanese language is unlike any other on Earth, literally. Scholars argue to this day where the Japanese language even originated. So, as you might guess, there are many theories on how the language even came about. After some searching, I found the theory many Western thinkers believe to be most plausible. That is, that the Japanese language has a remote relation to the Korean language. Linguists believe that based on the remaining similarities between the Korean and Japanese languages, the two must have diverged some 4,000 years ago. The theory goes something like, Korean rice farmers made their way to Japan at some point in history, thus introducing language and establishing a new and unique culture. Of course, this theory is not perfect, and some circles in Japan disapprove of it strongly, as it insinuates Japanese traditions, customs, and royal family came from a separate East Asian country. Another possible theory is simply that the people of Japan have always lived in Japan, and their language evolved as they did into what we now know today as Japanese. Whatever the case, the Japanese language does borrow heavily from Chinese symbols in its written aspects. In the 3rd and 4th century AD, the Japanese borrowed the Chinese writing system of ideographic characters. Since Chinese is not inflected, and since Chinese writing is ideographic rather than phonetic, the Chinese characters do not completely fill the needs of the inflected Japanese language in the sphere of writing. In the 8th century AD, two phonetic syllabaries, or kana, were devised for the recording of Japanese language. Usually, hiragana was used to represent postpositions and inflections. Katakana was later used primarily to import Western words in telegrams and sometimes in official documents. They are used along with ideographic characters, or kanji, to indicate the syllables that form suffixes and particles. After World War II, many kanji characters were simplified, and the number generally used was limited to about 2,000.
Japan is, in general, a fairly homogeneous place, and thus it is no surprise that 99% of its population speaks Japanese as a first language. However, the remaining 1% could speak anything from Korean, a dispersed language in Japan, to one of the many Ryukyuan languages such as Amami, Miyako, or Okinawan. Japan also hosts a surprisingly large number of dialects that differ in pronunciation, grammar, and vocabulary. Standard Japanese is the modernized dialect regulated by the government that is taught in schools, used on television, and during official communication. It is important to note that this standard form is the most often spoken in almost all parts of Japan. A distinct difference between the Eastern and Western dialects are accents used in the different regions. In West Japan, the more complex Kansai style pitch accent occurs, but in the East, the simpler Tokyo type accents are found. Other differences include the conjugation of verbs, where the Western Japanese conjugate the perfective form of yu verbs such as haro, meaning to play, as harota, rather than the Eastern harata. Eastern Japanese dialects use the copula da, while in Western Japanese most use ja or ya, with few exceptions. Additionally, in Eastern Japanese dialects, the negative form of verbs are nai and ne, but speakers of Western Japanese typically use nu or n. These conjugations also use a different stem. For example, this verb suru, meaning to do, could be sinu or sin in Western dialects, but it would be shinai or shine in Eastern ones. There are many other subtle differences between the Eastern and Western dialects, but for time's sake, we'll stop there. Check out the links at the end of the video for more information.